Jasmine, Crockett, and Ted Cruz face off in a fiery congressional hearing as billions of taxpayer dollars are being funneled into failing private schools under the guise of school choice. With over 2,100 public schools shut down in just 5 years and millions wasted, Jasmine exposes the harsh reality. Children are being used as profit for private investors. As Cruz defends a broken system, Jasmine demands to know, if the system is weak, why keep pouring money into it? Will the truth finally come to light, or will the cycle of exploitation continue at the cost of our children's futures? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The camera panned across the marble columns of the Capitol, where sunlight cut through the dome like a divine spotlight. But inside, the air was thick with tension. A congressional hearing on federal education funding was underway, and every seat was filled. Reporters whispered into their mics. Cameras clicked like distant gunfire. Then came the name that split the room like a crack of thunder: Senator Ted Cruz. He entered with the swagger of a man certain he'd already won. Blue tie perfect, smile rehearsed. "I'm here," he began, "to defend freedom, especially the freedom of every parent to choose the best for their child." His voice rang with the weight of scripted conviction. "School vouchers," he declared, "are not threats to education. They're lifelines to opportunity." A handful of his allies nodded, but the rest of the room stayed dead silent. Seconds later, the double doors at the back of the room eased open. A hush fell. In stepped Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Her pace was steady, her jaw tight, her presence undeniable. She wore a deep blue blazer, not flashy, not soft, a color of command. As she made her way toward her seat, whispers darted like arrows through the chamber. One aide leaned into another. "She's not playing defense today." Crockett didn't acknowledge the chatter. Her gaze stayed fixed. Her seat waited, directly across from Cruz. She sat, spine straight, hands folded atop a thick file stamped in red. Education crisis, public loss, private profit. No words yet, but the weight of her arrival was unmistakable. She wasn't just representing a district. She was representing every child in America whose school closed while private academies raised tuition behind gated fences. The battle line was drawn, the air tightened, and the hearing had only just begun. The room was holding its breath, still heavy from Jasmine Crockett's silent arrival. Cameras tilted, pens paused midair. But Senator Ted Cruz didn't wait. He leaned forward, voice steady, practiced, and unmistakably condescending. "Let's stop pretending the public school system is some noble victim," he said, his words cutting through the chamber like a blade. "It's not under attack. It's collapsing under its own weight. And we're the ones letting it happen." He raised a hand, gesturing toward no one and everyone at once. "The truth is simple. Public schools fail because they have no competition. They don't need to improve. They don't need to listen to parents. They just keep getting money, year after year, no matter how poorly they perform." He let that sink in, eyes sweeping across the panel, daring someone to interrupt. No one did. Then he went in harder. "Take my home state of Texas," he said, his tone sharpening like a prosecutor delivering Exhibit A. "Private schools, many of them small, faith-based, community-rooted, are delivering better results across the board. Test scores are higher. Classrooms are quieter. Kids are graduating and going to college, not jail." He paused, letting the weight of that last phrase land. "Meanwhile, we keep pouring billions into public schools where violence is rising, teachers are quitting, and students are falling behind." Cruz turned slightly, eyes aimed toward the television cameras now, speaking not just to Congress but to the living rooms of America. "So why are we forcing parents, especially low-income families, to keep their children in these environments?" His voice dropped half a note, quieter but more intense. "They don't get to choose. They don't get to leave. They're trapped by zip codes and bureaucracy while the rest of us send our kids wherever we please." Then came the line that made a few in the audience audibly shift in their seats. "This isn't just bad policy. It's cruelty wrapped in tradition." His tone darkened just enough to feel performative. "If you had the money, you'd never send your child to those schools. So why do we insist the poor should?" The words echoed longer than he expected. There were no immediate shouts, no applause, just a low murmur, One part approval, one part discomfort. But across from him, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. Her hands remained folded over the folder labeled Education Crisis, but her eyes had locked onto Cruz like a surgeon preparing for incision. She knew what he had left out. The budget stripped, the support staff fired, the libraries closed, the counselors gone, the heat shut off in classrooms that smelled of mold and sweat. She knew Cruz wasn't describing a natural failure. He was describing the end result of a system that had been bled dry, and now he stood there, blaming the victims. The silence after Cruz's speech was sharp, not a pause for reflection, but the edge of something about to break. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless for a moment, her eyes trained on him like a surgeon reading a vital sign flatlining. Then she leaned slightly forward, not rushed, not flustered, controlled, surgical. Her voice, when it came, was low and calm, but carved with precision. "Choice," she said, as if testing the word for cracks. "That's a powerful word, Senator. You said it like it's universal, like it's guaranteed. But let me ask you, what choice does a family have when the only door you offer leads to a school they can't afford, can't access, and wouldn't be welcomed into even if they tried?" Her tone didn't rise, but the temperature in the room did. "What choice?" she repeated, firmer now. "When 78% of low-income families don't meet the entry requirements or can't afford the hidden costs of the very institutions you claim are lifelines?" She picked up a thin packet from her folder and held it between two fingers. This report, compiled by 3 education watchdogs, shows that most private voucher-accepting schools require application fees, mandatory interviews, parental involvement hours, uniform costs, transportation arrangements, and in many cases, church attendance. She dropped it flat on the desk. The sound was soft but final. "You're calling that choice? That's not a lifeline. That's a lottery where the house always wins and the poor always lose." Her voice never wavered, but her eyes were like coals catching flame. "You don't call it exclusion because the gate's technically open, but you surround it with requirements designed to push families out before they even get a foot in." She shifted in her chair, face steady but fierce, like someone who had carried too many stories from too many parents who couldn't afford another rejection letter. "And let's be clear, these aren't luxury extras. They're barriers dressed up as standards. And while those barriers go up, the public schools in my district, the schools that do take everyone, are bleeding staff, closing programs, and turning libraries into storage closets because of the very policies you're defending." She paused, scanning the room. "So again, I ask, what choice are we really talking about, Senator? Because from where I'm sitting, it's not a choice. It's a carefully constructed illusion that leaves our most vulnerable families out in the cold." Again. The tension in the room thickened, but Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. Her gaze was fixed, her tone colder now, measured, deliberate, like a surgeon walking toward a wound no one else dared to touch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached into the folder before her and withdrew a thick, stapled packet, printed on plain government letterhead. The Department of Education seal glinted under the overhead lights. She held it up slowly, for the panel and the cameras. "Since we're talking about facts," she began, her voice low and controlled, "let's use real ones. Public, verified, impossible to ignore." She tapped the front page once with her finger. "This is a federal report, not opinion, not speculation, just numbers. Brutal, unavoidable numbers." Her eyes moved deliberately across the room, pinning each official in place. In the last 5 years across this country, 2,147 public schools have closed permanently, not paused, not consolidated, closed, gone. She paused, letting the words hit. That's over 2,000 communities that lost their only local school. Over 2,000 zip codes where children now wake up earlier, travel farther, and come home later, if they have anywhere to go at all. She took one step forward, laying the report flat on the table. And if you read the reasons, the most common thread isn't declining enrollment. It's not academic failure. It's not safety. It's funding. Her voice sharpened like glass under pressure. Funding redirected away from public schools into voucher programs, programs that send public money to private hands, with little oversight and even less accountability. She leaned slightly forward now, both hands braced on the table, voice steady but pulsing with moral urgency. Do you know what happens when a public school closes in a low-income neighborhood, Senator Cruz? That school wasn't just a classroom. It was a meal for kids who don't eat dinner. It was heating in the winter. It was the first adult to notice a bruise. It was the only counselor a depressed student would ever talk to. And now, it's boarded up, because the money meant to keep the lights on was handed to schools that never accepted those kids in the first place. She drew a breath, slow and deep, then finished with a voice like a blade. You didn't reform the system. You starved it, and then blamed it for dying. The silence from Jasmine Crockett's last line, you starved it, and then blamed it for dying, was still settling like smoke after an explosion. But she didn't give anyone time to breathe. Her voice came back sharper now, colder. The grief had shifted into something surgical. But let's be very clear, she said, reaching into the folder again. This wasn't just policy failure. This wasn't just ideological. She looked up, her eyes locked on Cruz. This was profitable. She turned and motioned to the digital monitor behind her. The screen flickered to life, revealing a sleek, meticulously detailed flowchart. It wasn't flashy. It was clinical. Black text, red arrows, gray boxes. But what it showed was devastating. Here, Jasmine said, stepping to the side so the camera could catch it, is how the voucher system moves money, not just away from public schools, but into political machines. She pointed to the first box labeled State Voucher Funds, then traced a red arrow to a second box labeled Private School Corporations. Her voice was steady, deadly. These are the schools receiving millions in taxpayer-funded vouchers, many of which serve fewer than 100 students and still report operating surpluses. She moved to the next link. Now follow this arrow, she said, tapping the thick red line that moved from those corporations to a third box. Educational Excellence Alliance. This foundation, she continued, has donated over $12 million in the past 4 election cycles, not to schools, not to communities, to political action committees, PACS. Then she let her finger land on the final box at the bottom of the chart. Liberty Learning PAC, $1.9 million to Ted Cruz, 2022 campaign. A few gasps rang out, not loud but sharp, like knives dragged across glass. Jasmine turned back to the panel. Her tone didn't rise, it didn't need to. So let's not pretend this is about the children, she said, each word crisp as ice. This is a feedback loop. Taxpayer dollars go to voucher schools. Those schools raise tuition, limit access, and funnel their excess to foundations. Those foundations fund PACs, and those PACs protect the very politicians who keep the voucher pipeline flowing. She paused, then glanced again at Cruz, not with anger but with clarity. You didn't just defend this system, you built it. And while the schools in my district are locking their front doors, your donors are cashing checks and calling it reform. The screen behind Jasmine Crockett still glowed with the hard, incriminating lines of the financial map. Names, arrows, PACs, all pointing toward one conclusion. But instead of responding with facts, Senator Ted Cruz leaned into something more practiced. Deflection wrapped in performance. He adjusted his cufflinks with casual precision, then leaned into the microphone with a condescending half-smile that told the audience he wasn't rattled. He was amused. There it is, he said, his voice smooth but dripping with theatrical fatigue. Congresswoman Crockett, the queen of distraction. His gaze never broke from her face, but he now spoke to the room as if she were no longer worth addressing directly. Every time she's confronted with data she doesn't like, she pivots, slides into some elaborate web of political dark money and corruption conspiracies. His hand gestured lazily toward the diagram still glowing behind her. It's a beautiful chart, but it's built on resentment, not reason. What she can't stand, he continued, letting the words sharpen, is that some families, when given the chance, are choosing to leave the system she wants to protect. He paused for effect, letting the sentence echo. Let's be honest, he added, leaning back with the confidence of a man reciting a well-used script. She's not fighting for equity. She's angry that some schools succeed without government control, that some students thrive in places she doesn't approve of, that some families, especially in working class and immigrant communities, want something more, and they're finally getting it. He sat forward now, hands clasped like a preacher at the pulpit. The real danger isn't failing schools. The real danger is one-size-fits-all thinking, bureaucratic arrogance, political conformity. That's what she's selling, dressed up as fairness. Then came the final blow, delivered with the sanctimony of a man who'd rehearsed it 100 times. Tyranny tells you where to go. Freedom lets you choose. That's what vouchers represent. Not corruption, not chaos. Choice. Choice. He let the word hang, polished, heavy, and hollow. The screen behind him still pointed in silence to the money trail he refused to see. The chamber still echoed with Cruz's closing line. Freedom lets you choose, like a bell rung in a cathedral. But Jasmine Crockett didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't smile. She simply let the silence stretch, let the weight of his words hang in the air, long enough for everyone to hear how hollow they truly were. Then she leaned forward, her voice calm but charged with something electric, controlled fury, rooted sorrow, unshakable truth. Freedom, she said slowly, as if testing the word herself. It sounds noble, it sounds patriotic, but let's not confuse the poetry of freedom with the practice of it. Her eyes moved across the room, not just toward Cruz, but to the other lawmakers, the press, the cameras, the families watching. Because freedom is just a beautiful word, unless you actually have access to it. Her voice didn't rise, but the tension in the room did. You can paint choice in red, white, and blue, but if the doors it leads to are blocked by application fees, transportation deserts, biased enrollment tests, and tuition gaps, then that's not choice. That's exclusion dressed up in democracy. She reached for a page in the report she had previously referenced and held it without reading. She already knew what it said. In the communities I represent, freedom doesn't come in brochures and policy slogans. It comes in questions like, can my kid walk to school safely? Will there be lunch if I can't afford groceries this week? Will the nurse be there on Monday when his asthma flares up again? Her voice cracked slightly, not from weakness, but from carrying too many stories that never made it to the floor of this chamber. When those basic questions go unanswered, your version of freedom becomes something else entirely, a weapon of privilege, a story told by those who never had to knock on a locked door. She looked directly at Cruz again, her words now precise and unrelenting. So no, Senator, don't tell me this is about freedom, because real freedom doesn't ask you to prove your worth before giving your child a future. Real freedom shows up for everyone. The weight of Jasmine Crockett's last line, real freedom shows up for everyone, had barely settled before she drew the room deeper into the numbers, into the quiet brutality that lived beneath the rhetoric. Her hand moved with quiet finality as she lifted a single-page report from the stack before her and laid it flat on the table. She didn't need theatrics. The facts were incendiary on their own. This, she said calmly, tapping the document, is a longitudinal study compiled by the National Center for Education Statistics in partnership with the Urban Policy Research Institute, two of the most respected, nonpartisan bodies in this field. She looked up, her eyes hard. It tracked the outcomes of students who received vouchers and enrolled in private institutions over a 5-year period. Her voice dropped slightly, not for dramatic effect, but because what came next didn't need to be shouted. 85% of those students, 85, did not remain in those private schools beyond the second year. She let the number sit, no spin, no interpretation, just the raw devastation of truth. She stepped forward, the paper still in her hand. But now she wasn't just speaking as a lawmaker. She was speaking as someone who had seen this unfold in real time, on real streets, in real families. And the reasons weren't mysterious. They weren't random. They were painfully predictable. Her voice hardened, syllables sharp. The tuition went up. The academic support never arrived. And the moment a child fell behind, struggled with a disability, showed signs of trauma, needed extra help, they were told, "This isn't the right fit." Jasmine's eyes narrowed. Fit? That's the word they use when they're done pretending. She took a breath, steady but low. And if the child happened to be Black or Latino or spoke English as a second language, that fit was questioned faster. Less patient guidance, less grace, more doors quietly closed. Her voice, though controlled, carried the burn of a deep injustice. These schools have the legal right to dismiss any student they deem too difficult, too poor, too different. And they do, without accountability, without transparency, without even having to explain themselves to the public that funded them. She raised the page slightly again, as if daring someone to dispute it. So when we talk about 85% failing to stay, it's not failure, it's filtering. Systematic, targeted, and deliberate. They weren't meant to stay. They were only meant to be counted until they became inconvenient. The data had landed like a hammer, but Jasmine Crockett knew numbers alone could be dismissed, spun, or buried in paperwork. What couldn't be ignored was a human face. She turned slowly to the audience gallery, her voice dipping into a lower, more solemn register. Sometimes the statistics speak, but today someone else will. She extended a hand toward a woman rising quietly from the third row. "This is Ayanna Fields," Jasmine said. "A mother, a voter, a woman who believed in the promise this chamber sold her." Ayanna moved to the microphone slowly, every step heavy with memory. Her black blazer was pressed but worn at the cuffs. In one hand, she held a crumpled sheet of paper, a rejection letter. In the other, a small photo of her son in a bright red hoodie, eyes wide with joy. But Ayanna's voice didn't carry that same joy. It came out thin at first, then steadied with purpose. "They told me this voucher would open doors," she said, "that my son would have a chance, that we finally had options." She paused, lips pressed together. "But 5 schools said no, not because of grades, not because we missed a deadline. They said he didn't meet their behavioral profile. He was 8. His crime was being curious, asking too many questions, struggling to sit still after his dad died." Her hands shook as she unfolded the rejection letter and held it up for the panel to see. "They never said it was about race, or trauma, or the fact that I work 2 jobs and can't volunteer on campus. But it was." She swallowed hard. His old public school, Jefferson Elementary, was shuttered the same year. They said funding had to be redirected. "The building is now a storage facility. My son's classroom is gone." Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "Now he rides 2 buses, 90 minutes each way, to a temporary learning center in a rented strip mall next to a pawn shop. There are no teachers with credentials, no counselor, no library, just folding chairs and worksheets." She looked up directly at the senators seated before her. Her words hit harder than any statistic Jasmine could have cited. "I was told I had freedom. What I got was a locked door with a smile on it." Then finally her voice broke. "And my son, he thinks it's his fault, that he wasn't good enough, that he didn't belong." The room was silent. No shuffle, no whisper. Only the image of an 8-year-old boy smiling from a photo and a mother holding on to him with nothing left but truth. The weight of Ayanna Fields' story still hung heavy in the chamber, a wound left open. Jasmine Crockett didn't try to soften the moment. She turned it into fuel. Her posture shifted, voice tightening into something sharper, colder, more deliberate. She stepped toward the touchscreen on the panel, tapped once, and the monitors behind her flared to life. The heading read in stark, all-caps font, "Internal Investigative Records, New Liberty Ed Foundation." "This," she said slowly, her tone like a courtroom indictment, "is what happens when public funds are handed over to private entities with no real guardrails." She gestured toward the screen. "The New Liberty Ed Foundation has received just over $120 million in taxpayer-funded vouchers in a span of 4 years. $120 million. Meant for students, meant for classrooms." She paused, her gaze scanning the panel. "And how many operational schools does this organization currently maintain?" She let the question settle, then answered it herself. 3. Just 3 schools. Not 30. 3. Her voice cut through the air like a blade through cloth. That's $40 million per school, none of which are accredited and one of which doesn't even meet state safety code. She tapped the screen again. The display shifted, now showing a breakdown of disbursements: $3.2 million in executive bonuses, $4.5 million in consulting contracts with unnamed vendors, $8.9 million in real estate acquisitions for future campus expansion, none of which ever materialize. These aren't investments in education, Jasmine said, her voice steady, bitter with truth. They're cash extractions disguised as reform. Then from a speaker mounted in the ceiling, a pre-recorded voice began to play. It was clinical, dispassionate, unmistakably damning. This is a verified excerpt from the independent forensic audit of the New Liberty Ed Foundation, the voice said. Over 68% of expenditures were categorized as administrative or indirect, with no documentation provided for 5 of the 8 claimed campus sites. Investigators were unable to verify enrollment at 2 locations. One address listed as a school was found to be an abandoned dry cleaner. The room went still, dead still. Jasmine didn't blink. "That's where your child's voucher went," she said quietly. "To a building with no lights, no desks, no teachers, just an empty shell wrapped in tax-funded promises." She looked back at the panel, then slowly around the chamber. "This isn't just waste. It's an engineered betrayal. And the people behind it didn't just take our money, they took our trust, and they used our children's names to do it." The damning audit had barely finished resonating across the chamber. Its final image, an abandoned dry cleaner posing as a school, still etched in the minds of everyone watching. But Senator Ted Cruz, visibly cornered, straightened in his seat and made a calculated pivot. His voice was more restrained now, tinged with frustration, masked as reason. He clasped his hands and leaned in as if guiding the room back to what he considered reality. "What we're witnessing here," Cruz said, carefully measured, "isn't a condemnation of school choice. It's a reflection of weak enforcement, poor management, bureaucratic sloppiness." His words came fast, layered with controlled indignation. "You don't throw out an entire movement because some administrators failed their oversight duties. That's not a policy failure. That's an execution flaw. We don't abandon innovation because the regulators fell asleep. We strengthen the guardrails. We increase transparency. We fix what's broken in implementation, not in principle." He paused, scanning the room like a professor lecturing a stubborn class. "The intent remains noble. The misuse of funds is unacceptable. But that's on the system, not on the solution." He might have continued, but he didn't get the chance. Jasmine Crockett didn't wait for him to finish adjusting the narrative. She leaned forward slowly, eyes fixed and voice low, but packed with unshakable force. "If you know the system is weak, Senator, then why keep feeding it?" The room snapped to stillness. There was no echo, no delay, just the heavy silence of impact. Her gaze didn't waver. "You just told us, on record, that the infrastructure is broken, that enforcement is flawed, that oversight is failing, and yet you want to keep channeling hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars through it?" She let the moment hang like a verdict. "You wouldn't pour water into a cracked pipe and act surprised when the floor floods. So why," she asked, voice cutting clean through his defense, "do you keep doing it with our children's futures?" The gravity of her last question had not yet lifted from the chamber. "Why do you keep doing it with our children's futures?" When Jasmine Crockett shifted again, no longer dissecting policy failure, but unmasking its moral foundation. Her tone darkened, her cadence slowed. Every word now carried the weight of indictment, not debate. "This isn't about education anymore," she said quietly, but with the chilling force of someone delivering a verdict. "This is educational capitalism, weaponized." Her eyes swept the room, daring anyone to flinch. "What we've built here isn't a school system, it's a marketplace. And in that marketplace, poor children are not students. They are currency. Their poverty is the pitch. Their struggle is the selling point. And their silence after the door is slammed in their face is the margin these private entities bank on." She gestured toward the earlier slides, still glowing dimly on the screen. Buildings without classrooms, budgets without transparency, schools without students. This isn't about opportunity, it's about volume, scale, return on investment, and no one's regulating the dealers. She took one step forward. Her voice, though still controlled, vibrated with something deeper, an accusation aimed not just at Cruz, but at an entire machine. We're not reforming education. We are commercializing its collapse. We are monetizing its failure and packaging it as freedom. She raised a hand slowly and clenched it into a fist. Not in theater, but in raw emphasis. When your solution depends on the failure of the system you're supposedly trying to fix, you're not a reformer. You're an opportunist. Her eyes locked back onto Cruz. And when billion-dollar hedge funds start opening schools in neighborhoods they wouldn't dare live in, not to serve, but to siphon, that's not education reform. That's exploitation with a tax ID. The air was thick, unmoving. Jasmine finished without theatrics, only truth. This is not a path to justice. This is a business model built on abandonment. And the longer we pretend otherwise, the deeper we sink into complicity. The room was still processing the weight of the previous revelations when Jasmine Crockett took another step forward, her expression hardening. She didn't need to raise her voice to command attention. What she said next carried the force of facts, of cold, unassailable truth. She clicked the remote again, and the screen behind her flickered to life, showing a dilapidated building in Jacksonville, Florida. The camera zoomed in on a faded sign that had once proudly announced a future, now decayed by neglect. New Horizons Preparatory Academy. It was hard to tell if the cracked, boarded-up windows were more of a metaphor or a warning. Jasmine didn't let the image linger too long, shifting to a financial breakdown, a chart showing the disbursement of over $4.2 million in voucher funds. Here we have New Horizons Preparatory Academy, she began, her voice steady, with no trace of emotion. A school that received over $4 million in public voucher money, taxpayer money. This school was funded to provide a quality education, a lifeline to children who had none. She paused, letting the weight of that statement hang in the air. But this school, this so-called opportunity, was a farce, a fraud. The next slide appeared on the screen. A report clearly marked State Oversight Review, New Horizons Academy. 6 months, Jasmine continued, her voice gaining strength. Just 6 months after receiving taxpayer funds, this school shut its doors. No notice, no explanation, no accountability, just empty classrooms. Her gaze never wavered as she moved closer to the screen, bringing the damning documents into sharper focus. And let me tell you what those 6 months looked like. According to this report, students were crammed into rooms without proper desks, without textbooks, without a teacher with the proper certification. She shook her head, disbelief mixing with anger. They weren't being taught. They were being abandoned, forced to watch videos, unvetted, unapproved, and completely unrelated to their curriculums. No structure, no support, just an empty building pretending to be a school. The room had gone unnervingly quiet, every eye fixed on her, every ear waiting for the next strike. Now, she continued, her voice dropping into a more pointed, sharper tone, let's talk about the people who enabled this. The people who signed off on this disaster, who made the decision to funnel millions of taxpayer dollars into this so-called educational model without ensuring that the money was actually going to serve the children it was supposed to help. Jasmine turned, her eyes locking onto Cruz, each word she spoke cutting through the air with precision. Who voted for this, Senator Cruz? The question hung in the air like a challenge, a dare. Cruz stiffened slightly in his chair, but he didn't flinch. He knew the question was coming, but Jasmine wasn't done yet. She tapped the remote again, and a new slide appeared. This one showed a list of names, each a part of the legislative body that had approved the funding for New Horizons Academy. Each name marked in bold. Names of people who had looked at the financial proposals, read the charter, and still gave their blessing to a school that couldn't even meet the most basic of standards. Here are the people who gave the green light to this travesty, Jasmine said, her voice full of quiet fury. These are the people who decided it was okay to send public funds to a failing organization and call it a success. These are the people who signed off on a lie, who turned a blind eye to the children suffering in the wake of their decisions. She turned back to Cruz. You want to talk about school choice? She said, the words like daggers. This is not choice. This is exploitation. This is about lining pockets and passing off failure as freedom. Jasmine's hand swept over the slide, indicating the names of lawmakers who had signed off on this school's funding. These are the same people who act like vouchers are a silver bullet without realizing they've handed out the keys to the kingdom to people who are only interested in how much money they can make, not how many children they can help. Jasmine stepped back, letting the information wash over the room. She let the faces of the culprits linger on the screen for just a moment too long. The weight of the names, the sheer audacity of the system that allowed this to happen, sank in like a heavy stone in the pit of every stomach present. "Do you know who paid the price for this?" she asked, her voice quiet now, almost too soft. "The children? The families who were promised a better education, a better chance at life. The kids who thought they were getting a shot at something better, only to find themselves locked in a system that wasn't designed to help them. A system that uses their struggles to make a profit." She paused for effect, letting every word land with the weight it deserved. Those children didn't get freedom. They got exploitation in the name of choice. Her voice hardened again as she turned toward Cruz, her gaze unflinching. "And you, Senator Cruz, you stand here, defending a system that allows this. You defend a system that puts dollars over children, that puts politics before education. And you don't even seem to care." She stood tall, resolute. "I'm asking you, who signed off on this, Senator Cruz? Who let this happen? Because this isn't just bad policy. This is criminal neglect. This is the kind of thing that breaks trust in the entire system. And those children, they'll never get their education back. They'll never get the time back." She stood there for a moment, staring down at Cruz, her voice carrying the full weight of the injustice laid bare before everyone. The room was utterly still, all eyes fixed on Jasmine, waiting for her next move. But for a moment, it wasn't about what she would say next. It was about the question she had asked, and the impossible weight of the truth she had just revealed. The room was still heavy with the weight of the evidence she had just laid out. Jasmine Crockett had torn the veil off a system that sold false promises and broken dreams, and now there was nothing left to do but call the question. She didn't rush. She took her time, her eyes moving slowly across the room, ensuring that everyone who needed to hear her words would feel their weight. She glanced toward Cruz, who was still sitting with his hands folded, a mask of forced composure on his face. But she knew he could feel it, feel the pressure. She knew, too, that the room felt it. The quiet, the stillness, the moment before something would shift. Then, with a quiet, deliberate movement, she turned toward the cameras, her gaze never wavering from the lens. The lights above her flickered slightly, casting a soft glow on her face. The audience, as if instinctively knowing what was coming, held their breath. Her voice, when it came, was as steady as ever. No shout, no outburst, but every word wrapped in truth so sharp it could cut through steel. "If your policies are truly about the children, Senator Cruz," she began, her eyes never leaving the camera, "then why is it that the vast majority of those children are left in silence, unable to speak for themselves? Their schools shut down, their futures stolen. And yet, not one of you here has spoken up?" The question wasn't just directed at Cruz. It was directed at everyone in that room, at every lawmaker who had stood by and let this happen. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with the unspoken truth of what had been revealed. Then slowly the sound came, a soft clap at first, tentative, almost as if the audience wasn't sure whether it was allowed to break the tension. But it didn't take long before the applause grew louder, filling the room with its thunderous weight. It was a wave, a force of collective recognition and moral clarity. It wasn't just for Jasmine's words, it was for the children who had been left behind. It was for the families who had been betrayed. The applause swelled, louder and more insistent, until the room was reverberating with it, the walls almost shaking. Jasmine stood there still, letting it wash over her. She didn't need the applause, but she knew what it meant. She knew it wasn't for her. It was for the children who had no voice, the parents who had no power, and the system that had taken everything from them and then tried to justify it as choice. She turned back toward Cruz, her eyes narrowing just slightly, but her expression was unchanged, calm, composed, unyielding. He had heard the question, he had heard the truth, and now he had no place to hide. For the first time, Cruz's facade faltered. His fingers twitched, a barely perceptible movement, but it was enough to show the crack in his armor. His eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, darted away from Jasmine's gaze. He cleared his throat, trying to reassert control over the moment, but it was too late. His silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. The room had already turned its attention back to Jasmine, and Cruz knew deep down that the tide had shifted. He was no longer in control of the narrative. The applause, though not for him, had buried him in its wake. He was left to sit, to stew in the truth that had just been laid bare. Jasmine didn't speak again. She didn't need to. She had already asked the question that mattered. She had already forced the truth into the light. There was nothing left for Cruz to say that could undo the damage. And in that moment, it wasn't about Cruz. It wasn't about the politics. It wasn't about the debate or the headlines. It was about the children who would never get back their lost years. It was about the families who had been sold a lie. And most of all, it was about the undeniable weight of justice, sitting squarely on Jasmine Crockett's shoulders, staring Cruz and everyone else down. The room held its breath one last time, and then slowly, Jasmine turned away, her task complete. The room buzzed with the tension of unanswered questions, the weight of every word Jasmine Crockett had spoken pressing down on the chamber. The applause had faded, but the echoes of it still reverberated in the minds of everyone present. Cruz, still silent, shifted in his seat, his face tight, his mind racing for a defense. But Jasmine was no longer speaking to him. She wasn't even speaking to the panel anymore. She was speaking to the future, speaking to the people whose lives hung in the balance of the policies they voted on today. She stepped forward again, this time with purpose. Her voice rang out, steady and unwavering. "Let me make something perfectly clear," she said, pausing, her eyes sweeping over the room. "I'm not here to attack religion. I'm here to attack the people who use religion as a mask, as a tool to siphon public funds for their own profit." Her words cut through the air with the precision of a blade, aimed directly at the heart of the hypocrisy she had just exposed. It's not about faith, it's about greed. It's about individuals who have found a way to exploit a system that's supposed to help children, not enrich their pockets. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, her gaze locked onto Cruz, daring him to deny the truth. It's not about schools. It's not about the children's futures. It's about taking money that should go to public education. Money meant to educate every child, regardless of their background, and putting it into the hands of private investors who have no interest in these children's success, only in the size of their returns. She didn't flinch as her words hung heavy in the air, challenging anyone who might still try to defend the system. She was deconstructing piece by piece. "And I'll tell you this right now," she continued, voice rising with a quiet, measured intensity. "I'm not going to sit by while this goes on any longer. I'm not going to let this travesty continue to strip away the very foundation of our public education system. I won't be silent, and neither should any of you." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle in. "I will introduce, immediately after this hearing, the Public School Protection Act, a bill designed to safeguard our schools from this predatory system. A bill that will ensure every dollar of public funding goes to public schools that serve all students, not just those who can afford to pay for privilege. It will hold those accountable who are using the system to profit off our children's futures." She didn't look away. The camera zoomed in on her face, and for a moment everything else in the room faded into the background. Jasmine wasn't just standing before them. She was standing for something much larger, something much more powerful than any political game. This bill will make sure that our public schools are protected from those who seek to turn education into a commodity. It will hold accountable anyone who seeks to profit from our children's futures. And it will protect the one system that is supposed to serve all of us equally. Her voice grew sharper, each syllable deliberate and cutting through the room like a final command. "You want to stand for the children? Stand for the ones who have no choice? Stand for the ones who have no voice in this system? Stand for the ones whose futures are being stolen from them under the guise of freedom of choice?" She took a slow, deliberate breath, then added, "This isn't freedom, Senator Cruz. It's exploitation dressed up in the language of opportunity." She glanced back at the screen one last time. where the images of the neglected schools, New Horizons Preparatory Academy, still loom large like ghosts of promises broken. We are not giving these children a choice. We are giving them a system that fails them. We are giving them an illusion of opportunity, but no real future. Her voice softened slightly, but the impact remained the same. This ends now. It ends with us. She turned back to Cruz, who had been quietly watching her, his face flushed, his hands now tense in his lap. So, I'll ask again, who stands with the children? Who stands with the communities that have been left behind? Because I know where I stand. I'm standing for every single student who has been left to suffer while you've sold them a dream of a system that's nothing but a mirage. As Jasmine spoke, the camera zoomed out, capturing not just her, but the faces of those in the room, some nodding, some looking away. The decision had been made, not by Cruz, not by the panel, but by her, by every mother, every child, every teacher, and every neglected school she represented. She wasn't waiting for permission anymore. The air in the room was thick, almost electric. It wasn't just a speech, it was a moment. And for the first time that day, the fight wasn't just political, it was personal. Every word she had spoken had taken aim at the very core of an unjust system, and now it was clear. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't going anywhere. Jasmine Crockett stepped away from the microphone, the tension of the moment still hanging heavy in the air. But as she moved, her eyes never left Cruz, nor did the eyes of the audience. They knew she had made her stand, and now there was no turning back. As the final words of Jasmine Crockett's speech hung in the air, a silence fell over the chamber. The tension was palpable, but the battle had already shifted, away from Cruz, away from the bureaucratic talk, away from the policies that sought to deceive the public. Now the stakes were clearer than ever. The focus was no longer on the convoluted rhetoric, but on the lives being directly impacted by the system Cruz had so ardently defended. Without a word, Jasmine clicked the remote again, and the screens behind her flickered to life. This time, it wasn't a diagram of financial malfeasance or political maneuvering. It was a classroom, a dilapidated room lit by flickering fluorescent lights that did little to brighten the dust-covered windows. The walls were scarred, cracked, and peeling. The desks, mismatched and worn, sat in rows like forgotten soldiers, each seat carrying the weight of dreams unfulfilled. But it wasn't the room that struck hardest. It was the children. The camera panned slowly over a row of students, their hands raised high, faces full of hope, but haunted by a deeper understanding of the reality they lived in. Their uniforms were faded, their notebooks barely held together by fraying edges. One child, barely 12, clutched a pencil so tightly that his knuckles had gone white, but he never stopped reaching for the sky, hoping his hand would be the one chosen. Next to him, a girl raised her hand with a determined look, her uniform crumpled and her shoes worn, but she was undeterred. Each face in that room, despite the weariness of the world they faced, still clung to that small hope. The hope that they mattered, that their futures mattered. The camera lingered on the children for a moment, showing their yearning, their unspoken understanding that their education was a game of survival, not opportunity. The room was still, yet in their eyes there was a quiet revolution, an unvoiced cry that no one in power was hearing. And then, in bold, stark letters across the screen, a question appeared. Who is truly being educated and who is being sacrificed? The question burned into the minds of everyone watching, a question that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. The silence that followed was deafening. The weight of it all hung in the air like the thickest fog, clouding every rational explanation, every politician's defense. It was a simple truth, one so sharp it couldn't be twisted into anything else. Jasmine's voice echoed in the background, not as a direct address to the chamber, but as a lingering truth that refused to fade. The children in this room will never be given the resources they deserve, she said, her words slow and deliberate. But they still raise their hands. They still reach for the stars, even though the very system that should be lifting them up has abandoned them. The camera focused on the children's faces as they looked up, not knowing if their hand would be chosen, but still believing it might be, still believing they had a shot. But Jasmine knew the truth they weren't yet ready to understand. The system wasn't going to choose them, not the way it should. The system wasn't meant to raise them up. It was designed to keep them down, to prioritize profit over potential. And the children in that room, those innocent hands raised in the hope of a better future, were the price they were all paying. The screen flickered again, this time showing a wide shot of the classroom, empty except for those hands still raised. They were the last remnants of hope in a place that had given up on them long ago. The camera zoomed out, but the haunting image of their outstretched hands stayed with you. Those hands reached for a future that was never meant to be theirs. The weight of Jasmine's words was undeniable, and the room felt suffocating in its stillness. The children, the future of the nation, had been abandoned by a system that called itself a savior while quietly stripping them of every chance. Every child raised their hand, hoping for a future that was slipping farther and farther away, all the while knowing that in the end, they were the ones paying the price for the choices made by people who would never know their names. The shot faded slowly, but not before the words across the screen became etched in everyone's minds. Who is truly being educated, and who is being sacrificed? And as the screen went dark, the question didn't fade. It lingered in the air like smoke from a fire no one was willing to extinguish. The room remained heavy, still vibrating with the silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's call to action. But the questions she posed, the questions that had hung in the air, were not ones that could be easily answered with simple policy or rhetoric. This wasn't just about laws. It was about something deeper. It was about lives, real, fragile, struggling lives that were caught in the crossfire of systems designed to profit from their pain. And as the chamber settled, the spotlight shifted, not to the political combatants, but to the undeniable reality of what had been revealed. Jasmine knew this wasn't just another fight in a long list of political battles. This wasn't about winning or losing. This was about something that transcended every speech, every argument, every vote. This was about the human cost, the children whose futures were gambled away before they even had a chance to dream. She stood there for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle in her chest, but she knew she couldn't leave it there. Not now, not after everything she had seen. "This is the price of inequality," she said, her voice now softer, but firm, like the last ember of a dying fire. Her eyes swept the room once more, not with anger, but with something far more powerful: resolve. The price of turning our backs on the ones who need us the most. There was no need to name names anymore. The evidence was already clear. The disparity in the room between the children whose lives hung in the balance and the system that refused to protect them was staggering. Jasmine's words were not just a call for justice, but a summons to the conscience of everyone who had a hand in perpetuating the brokenness of a system designed to abandon its most vulnerable. "When we allow this to continue," she continued, her voice steady, yet carrying an unspoken weight, "we are allowing the theft of hope. We are selling out our future to the highest bidder. And we are teaching our children that the value of their lives is measured not in the promise of an education, but in the weight of their parents' pockets." The room could feel it, the magnitude of the question hanging in the air, asking them all to look at the lives they had been ignoring for so long. The choice wasn't whether they could fix the system. It was whether they had the courage to recognize the injustice that had already taken root. Jasmine paused for just a heartbeat, allowing the gravity of her statement to sink in. Then, in a voice that broke through the silence like a trumpet's call, she continued, "This is not just a policy issue. This is a human issue. This is about us, about who we are and what we stand for. And it is about how far we are willing to let things go before we say enough is enough." She took a step back, her words ringing in the chamber as if they were the conclusion to a long-fought battle. "We can't pretend this system is about choice, because it's not. It's about who gets to decide which children have a future and which children are left behind." She paused again, the room holding its breath, not just because of her words, but because of what they meant. For too long, too many people had turned a blind eye to the suffering of those who didn't have the privilege to fight for themselves. For too long, the system had been designed to protect the few at the expense of the many. And as Jasmine stood there, she wasn't just talking to Cruz. She was talking to every person in that room, to every person who had the power to change the course of a generation. We can no longer be passive, she said, the challenge now clear in her voice, the final call to arms. We must demand that our future, the future of our children, be built on something better than the bones of broken promises. We must demand that education become a right, not a privilege, that every child, regardless of their background, deserves the opportunity to rise, to learn, to grow. Her words echoed throughout the room, their resonance undeniable. If we believe in fairness, in equality, in justice, we must act. If we believe that every child deserves the same chance at success, we must make that belief our reality. As she finished speaking, the gravity of her words settled on everyone present, and for a long moment it was as though time itself had come to a halt. The silence wasn't just a pause, it was the deep, collective acknowledgement of the brokenness that existed. The silence was the space where every person in that room was confronted with the truth that had been laid bare by Jasmine's words. The choices they made in the next moments would not only define their political legacies, but would determine the lives of those children whose futures were on the line. This is not a political game, Jasmine continued, her voice softer now, yet no less commanding. This is a fight for the soul of our nation. This is a fight for what we stand for. And I will not be quiet until those children have the future they deserve. Her words left a ringing silence in the chamber. The faces of the people in the room were hard to read, but the weight of her resolve was unmistakable. The injustices she had exposed couldn't be ignored anymore. They were standing in the light, unprotected by the walls of bureaucracy and indifference that had hidden them for so long. She stepped back, looking directly at Cruz, then at the others who had been complicit in the system. She didn't need to say another word. Her stance, her unwavering conviction, her willingness to speak the truth. It was enough. The camera panned back over the empty classrooms, over the abandoned schools that were meant to uplift but had been gutted by greed and neglect. The children's hands, still raised in silent defiance, had been the ones left behind, the ones whose futures had been bartered away. And Jasmine, standing at the forefront of this fight, wasn't just asking for change, she was demanding it. It's time we asked ourselves, what is the future worth? And who will we be when it's gone? The tension in the room still crackled, like the final moments of a storm. The truth Jasmine Crockett had just exposed hung in the air, the weight of it pressing down on everyone present. The echoes of the damning revelations hadn't yet faded, but Jasmine didn't let the moment linger too long. She had more to say. This wasn't about just winning an argument. This was about something bigger. It was about an entire system that had failed the very people it was supposed to protect. The children, the families, the future of the country. She stood still for a moment, taking a slow, deliberate breath. Her eyes swept across the room, making contact with the faces of the lawmakers, some still in shock, others looking away, unable to meet her gaze. Then she spoke, her voice steady, but filled with the weight of everything that had come before. "I'm not here to attack religion," she said, her voice clear and calm, though it carried a deep and quiet conviction. "I'm here to attack the people who use religion as a shield, who hide behind faith to siphon public funds for their own enrichment." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone to refute her. She didn't pause. "This isn't about faith, it's about greed. It's about exploiting a system designed to help the most vulnerable and turning it into a profit-driven machine that leaves children behind." Her voice rose now, every word deliberate, every syllable punctuating the injustice. "We are not reforming education. We are commodifying failure. We are taking public dollars meant for public schools, meant for all children, and funneling them into a private sector that isn't accountable to anyone. This is not about choice. This is about creating a two-tier system where the wealthy get everything and the poor are left to fight for scraps." The room seemed to draw a collective breath as her words cut through the air, relentless and raw. But Jasmine wasn't done. She stepped forward, every movement sharp and purposeful. "And I won't stand by while people profit from our children's futures. I won't stand by while we allow private interests to take what should be the public's right. I won't stand by while we abandon those most in need and call it freedom." She paused then, her eyes locking with Cruz, who had remained silent, but who now seemed to shrink under her gaze. The chamber was still. Her next words came slowly, measured but with the power of truth behind them. I will introduce, immediately following this hearing, the Public School Protection Act, a bill that will ensure that every dollar of public funding goes to public schools that serve all students, and not to private institutions that treat children as commodities to be bought and sold. Her voice softened, but there was no mistaking the resolve behind it. This bill will protect the schools that need it most, the schools that welcome every child regardless of their race, their income, their background. And it will hold accountable those who have exploited this system for their own gain. It will ensure that no child is left behind because someone else chose to make a profit off of their future. Jasmine stood there for a moment, looking at the faces around her, the weight of the moment heavy in the air. The fight wasn't just about politics. It was about the soul of the nation, about whether it would continue to abandon its most vulnerable for the sake of convenience and profit. And Jasmine Crockett, in that moment, wasn't just a politician. She was the voice for those who had been silenced, the advocate for those who had been left behind. "This is the fight we must have," she said, voice ringing with conviction. "Because our children deserve better. They deserve a future built on education, not exploitation. And I will keep fighting until that future is a reality." The silence that followed was not one of hesitation, but one of recognition. The question had been asked. The challenge had been laid down. And now it was up to those in the room, those with the power to change, to make the decision. Would they stand for justice, or would they continue to let a broken system sacrifice the future of their children? And for Jasmine, there was no turning back. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.